Picture a sleepy English village, Chipping Hollow, buzzing with excitement for its annual cricket match. The sun shines, the pavilion gleams, but beneath the cheers lies a web of secrets. Old grudges, hidden debts, and a forbidden love from decades past. When groundskeeper Tom Harrow is found dead, bludgeoned in the pavilion, Miss Jane Marple, with her sharp eyes and quiet wisdom, unravels the truth. A blue thread, a strange cigarette, a cryptic letter. Who among the charming captain, the nervous doctor, or the vicar's troubled son is hiding a deadly truth? In this classic mystery, no one is what they seem, and murder is just a step away from village gossip. Chapter 1. The Village of Chipping Hollow. The sun hung low over the gentle hills of Chipping Hollow, casting a golden glow across the village green where the cricket pavilion stood, its whitewashed walls gleaming with fresh paint. The village, a patchwork of thatched cottages and winding lanes, hummed with the quiet anticipation that always preceded the annual cricket match against Little Wetherby. It was the sort of day Miss Jane Marple thought, as she settled beneath the broad canopy of an ancient oak that seemed crafted for simple pleasures, tea and bone china cups, the crack of a bat on a ball, and the soft murmur of village gossip. Her knitting needles moved with practiced ease, the soft click-clack a counterpoint to the distant laughter of children chasing a stray dog across the green. Miss Marple had arrived in Chipping Hollow only 3 days prior, at the invitation of her old school friend, Mrs. Beatrice Langley, whose husband, Colonel Arthur Langley, presided over the Chipping Hollow Cricket Club, with the same military precision he had once applied to his regiment. Beatrice, a cheerful woman with a penchant for bright scarves and slightly muddled stories, had insisted Miss Marple visit for the match. "It's the event of the year, Jane," she had written, her looping script filling the page. "You'll find it dreadfully dull, I'm sure, but Arthur would be so pleased, and the village is quite charming." Miss Marple, never one to refuse an opportunity to observe human nature, had packed her modest suitcase and arrived with her knitting bag and a keen eye for the undercurrents that ripple beneath even the most placid surfaces. The pavilion itself was a modest affair, with a steeply pitched roof and a veranda where ladies sipped lemonade and gentlemen debated the merits of spin bowling. Inside, a small scoring room held the scorebooks and trophies that chronicled decades of village victories and defeats. Today, the pavilion was festooned with bunting, and a table groaned under the weight of sandwiches, scones, and a particularly fine Victoria sponge, courtesy of the Women's Institute. Villagers milled about, their voices bright with excitement, though Miss Marple's sharp ears caught snatches of less cheerful talk. There was mention of a disagreement over a plot of land near the pavilion, and a few raised eyebrows at the behaviour of the cricket team's captain, Roger Blake, whose charm was said to mask a ruthless streak. As the teams took to the field, Chipping Hollow in crisp whites, Little Wetherby in navy caps, the atmosphere was electric. Colonel Langley, resplendent in a blazer adorned with the club's crest, stood on the pavilion steps, delivering a brief speech about sportsmanship that was met with polite applause. Miss Marple, her eyes half closed against the sun, noted the players. Roger Blake, tall and confident, tossing the ball with a showman's flair. Dr. Ernest Finch, the village physician, whose thin frame seemed to quiver with nervous energy. And young Peter Weston, the vicar's son, whose boyish face betrayed a flicker of unease as he glanced toward the pavilion. It was just as the first bowler began his run-up that a scream tore through the air, sharp and jarring, like a needle skipping on a gramophone. The crowd froze, heads turning toward the pavilion. Mrs. Langley, standing near Miss Marple, dropped her teacup, the porcelain shattering on the grass. "Good heavens!" she gasped, clutching Miss Marple's arm. "What was that?" Before anyone could answer, a young woman, Lucy Carter, the baker's daughter, stumbled from the pavilion, her face ashen. "It's Tom!" she cried, her voice trembling. "Tom Harrow! He's dead!" A murmur rippled through the crowd, followed by a rush toward the pavilion. Colonel Langley, his face flushed, barked orders to keep back, but Miss Marple, moving with surprising agility for a woman of her years, followed him inside. The scoring room was dim, its single window casting a shaft of light across a scene of chaos. Tom Harrow, the village groundskeeper, lay crumpled on the floor, his grizzled face frozen in a grimace. Beside him was a cricket bat, its polished surface stained with blood. A chair lay overturned, scorebooks were scattered, and a faint smell of tobacco lingered in the air. Miss Marple's eyes, bright and bird-like, took in every detail. The angle of Tom's body, the untouched cup of tea on the table, the curious absence of dust on the bat's handle. She stepped closer, her sensible shoes silent on the wooden floor, and noticed a faint scuff mark on the windowsill, as if someone had climbed through in haste. "Poor man," she murmured, though her mind was already turning, sifting through the fragments of what she had seen and heard. Tom Harrow, she knew, had been a fixture in Chipping Hollow, a man of few words but deep roots, trusted to tend the green as if it were his own. Who, she wondered, could have hated him enough to end his life so brutally? As Colonel Langley sent for the police, Miss Marple returned to her chair under the oak. Her knitting resumed as if nothing had happened. But her thoughts were far from idle. She recalled a case from her youth in another village where a seemingly simple man had died for reasons far from simple. There is always, she thought, more to a village than meets the eye. And as the distant wail of a police siren approached, Miss Marple's needles clicked on, weaving not just wool, but the first threads of a solution to the murder at the cricket pavilion. Chapter 2. The Scene of the Crime. The cricket pavilion, so recently a hub of village pride, now stood under a pall of shock as the news of Tom Harrow's death spread like wildfire through Chipping Hollow. The golden afternoon light seemed to mock the grim scene within, where the air hung heavy with the scent of polished wood and tragedy. Miss Jane Marple, her small figure unobtrusive amidst the gathering crowd, followed Colonel Langley and a handful of villagers into the dim interior of the scoring room. Her eyes, sharp as ever behind their mild expression, took in the chaos with a calm that belied the horror before her. She had seen death before, in its many guises, and knew that its presence often revealed more about the living than the dead. Inspector Craddock arrived with commendable speed, his police car crunching to a halt on the gravel path outside the pavilion. A tall man with a weathered face and a no-nonsense manner, he was known to Miss Marple from previous encounters, and she noted with approval the brisk efficiency with which he cordoned off the scene. The scoring room, a cramped space lined with shelves of dusty scorebooks and faded photographs, was a study in disorder. Tom Harrow lay sprawled across the floor, his sturdy frame unnaturally still, a dark pool of blood seeping into the worn boards beneath his head. Beside him lay a cricket bat, its once pristine surface marred by a gruesome stain. A chair lay overturned, its legs pointing skyward like an accusation, and papers, score sheets and old club notices, were scattered as if caught in a sudden gust. "Blunt force trauma," Craddock muttered, crouching beside the body, his notebook already open. "Likely the bat. No sign of a struggle, though. Odd for a man of Tom's build." He glanced up, catching Miss Marple's eye. "Miss Marple, I didn't expect to see you here. Care to share any observations?" Miss Marple, her hands folded neatly over her knitting bag, stepped closer, her gaze lingering on the bat. "It's curious, Inspector," she said softly, "that the handle is so clean. One might expect fingerprints, or at least smudges, from such a violent act." Her voice was gentle, almost apologetic, but Craddock knew better than to dismiss her. He nodded, signalling to a constable to bag the bat for examination. The room offered other clues, though they were subtle. The single window set high in the wall was slightly ajar, its latch loose. A faint scuff mark marred the sill, a smudge of dirt that suggested someone had clambered through, perhaps in haste. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she studied it, her mind conjuring an image of a figure slipping out into the dusk. Nearby, on the floor, lay a cigarette stub, its brand unfamiliar to her, a detail she tucked away for later. The cup of tea on the table, untouched and cold, bore a faint ring of lipstick. Though Lucy Carter, who had found the body, swore she hadn't touched it. "I only looked in and saw him," she had stammered, her eyes wide with fright. "I didn't go near." Craddock began his interviews with the cricket team, who had been closest to the pavilion when the scream rang out. Roger Blake, the team captain, lounged against the wall with a studied ease that bordered on insolence. A solicitor by trade, his handsome face and polished manners had won him many admirers in Chipping Hollow, but Miss Marple noted the hardness in his eyes. "I was on the field, Inspector," he said, his voice smooth. "Tossing the ball, warming up, ask anyone." His smile was confident, but Miss Marple observed the way his fingers drummed against his thigh, a small tell of unease. Dr. Ernest Finch, the village physician, was next, his thin hands twisting a handkerchief as he spoke. "I was in the pavilion earlier, checking the first aid kit," he said, his voice high and strained. "But I left well before this happened. I was in my surgery, I think." His hesitation was slight, but Miss Marple caught it, as she caught the faint tremor in his hands. Dr. Finch, she recalled, had a reputation for kindness, but also for debts, a fact whispered about in the village shop. Peter Weston, the vicar's son, was the youngest of the trio, his boyish face pale as he stood before Craddock. Barely 20, with a mop of dark hair and eyes that darted nervously, he seemed on the verge of tears. "I was with the team," he said quickly. "I didn't see anything, I swear it." His voice cracked, and Miss Marple noted the way he clutched the edge of his sweater, as if anchoring himself against a storm. She remembered seeing him earlier, lingering near the pavilion, his gaze fixed on the scoring room door. As Craddock continued his questions, Miss Marple slipped outside, her sensible shoes silent on the grass. The pavilion's exterior offered little at first glance, but she circled it slowly, her eyes scanning the ground. Near the window, she found a patch of earth disturbed, as if someone had stepped heavily. A single blade of grass, bent and bruised, caught her attention, and she bent to examine it, her mind turning over the possibilities. "Someone left in a hurry," she murmured, straightening up. The scuff mark, the cigarette, the clean bat handle. These were pieces of a puzzle, and Miss Marple knew from long experience that puzzles, however complex, always had a solution. Back inside, Colonel Langley was attempting to restore order, his military bearing at odds with the tremor in his voice as he addressed the villagers. "We must remain calm," he urged, though his eyes strayed to the scoring room door. Mrs. Langley, hovering nearby, clutched Miss Marple's arm. "Jane, it's dreadful," she whispered. "Tom was such a good man. Who could do this?" Miss Marple patted her hand, her expression sympathetic but her thoughts elsewhere. Tom Harrow, she knew, had been more than a groundskeeper. He was a man with a history, with ties to the village that ran deep and perhaps tangled. As the sun dipped below the hills, casting long shadows across the green, Craddock emerged from the pavilion, his face grim. "We'll need statements from everyone," he said, his eyes meeting Miss Marple's. This wasn't a random act. Someone knew exactly what they were doing. Miss Marple nodded, her mind already sifting through the morning's events. The whispers of land disputes, the flicker of unease in Peter's eyes, the oddity of a lipstick-stained cup in a room where no woman claimed to have been. She thought of a case from years ago, in another village, where a man's death had seemed simple until the smallest details unravelled a web of deceit. "People," she said softly, almost to herself, "are so very careless with their secrets." As the crowd dispersed and the pavilion stood silent under the gathering dusk, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, her needles clicking like the ticking of a clock. The murder at the cricket pavilion was a mystery, but mysteries, she knew, were merely truths waiting to be uncovered. Chapter 3. Village Secrets. The morning after Tom Harrow's murder, Chipping Hollow awoke to a subdued hush, as if the village itself were holding its breath. The cricket green, usually alive with the chatter of early risers, lay quiet under a veil of mist. The pavilion, a silent sentinel of the previous day's horror. Miss Jane Marple sat in the drawing-room of the Langley Manor, a delicate teacup balanced in her hand, her knitting resting on her lap like a faithful companion. Mrs. Beatrice Langley, her hostess, bustled about, her bright scarf a splash of colour against her anxious expression. "It's simply dreadful, Jane," she said, arranging a plate of biscuits with unnecessary care. "Tom was such a fixture here. Who could have done such a thing?" Miss Marple's eyes, bright and perceptive behind her gentle smile, followed Beatrice's movements. "People often surprise us, Beatrice," she said softly. "Even in a place as peaceful as Chipping Hollow, there are always secrets." Her tone was mild, but her mind was alert, piecing together the fragments of conversation she had overheard the previous day. The village, she knew, was a tapestry of small jealousies and hidden grudges, and Tom Harrow's death was a tear that threatened to unravel it. Beatrice, settling into an armchair, launched into the village gossip with the eagerness of one unburdening a heavy load. "There's been talk, you know, about Tom and Roger Blake," she confided, lowering her voice. "Roger wanted to buy that patch of land Tom owned, just beyond the pavilion. It's small, but it's prime for building, a cottage or two perhaps. Roger had plans, but Tom wouldn't hear of it. Said the land was for the village, not for profit." She paused, glancing toward the window as if expecting Roger himself to appear. "They had words last week, quite heated, I'm told." Miss Marple nodded, her needles clicking rhythmically. She recalled Roger's confident demeanour at the Pavilion, the way his charm seemed to mask a sharper edge. "And was Roger the only one with a grievance?" she asked, her voice deceptively casual. Beatrice hesitated, then leaned closer. "Well, there's Dr. Finch, too. He treated Tom's wife, Mary, before she passed last year. Tom never paid the full bill, said he couldn't afford it, though everyone knew he had savings. Dr. Finch was cross about it, especially since his practice hasn't been doing well. I saw them arguing outside the chemist's a month ago. Ernest looked positively livid." Miss Marple's mind turned to Dr. Finch, his nervous manner and the tremor in his hands. A man in financial straits, she knew, could be driven to desperate acts, though murder seemed a drastic step. She filed the thought away, her attention caught by another name Beatrice mentioned. "And young Peter Weston," Beatrice continued, her tone softening. "Such a nice boy, but he's been odd lately. Tom caught him sneaking about the Pavilion one night last month. Peter said he was looking for a lost cricket ball, but Tom didn't believe him, threatened to tell the vicar, I heard." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly. Peter's nervous glances at the Pavilion yesterday had not escaped her notice, nor had his hurried alibi. "Young men," she murmured, "can be so impulsive." She thought of a case in another village years ago, where a boy's rash act had spiraled into tragedy. Could Peter, with his boyish face and anxious eyes, be hiding something more than youthful folly? Leaving the manor, Miss Marple strolled through Chipping Hollow's lanes, her black lace-up shoes tapping lightly on the cobblestones. The village was stirring now, with women hanging laundry and men heading to the fields. But the usual cheer was muted. At the post office, she paused to chat with Mrs. Price, the postmistress, whose sharp tongue was matched only by her sharp memory. "Tom Harrow was a stubborn one," Mrs. Price said, sorting letters with a flick of her wrist. "Never let go of that land, no matter who asked. And he had a long memory, too. Did you know he was once sweet on a girl from Little Wetherby? Clara Reed, her name was. Broke his heart when she left him, nigh on 30 years ago." Miss Marple's interest quickened. "Clara Reed, you say? And what became of her?" "Married a man from London, I think," Mrs. Price replied. "But her nephew, Michael Reed, plays for Little Wetherby's team. He was here yesterday, strutting about like he owned the place. Smokes those fancy cigarettes, too, always dropping them everywhere." Miss Marple's thoughts flicked to the cigarette stub she had seen in the scoring room, its brand unfamiliar. A connection, perhaps, though she cautioned herself against leaping to conclusions. Later, at the village shop, Miss Marple learned more. The shopkeeper, Mr. Dobbs, mentioned that Tom had recently visited the local solicitor, not Roger Blake, but an older man in the next town, to revise his will. "Heard he left that land to the cricket club," Mr. Dobbs said, weighing out sugar. "Made Roger Blake mad as a hornet, I reckon. He'd been counting on that plot." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind turning over this new piece of the puzzle. A will changed, a land dispute, an old romance. The threads were beginning to form a pattern, though it was still faint. As she walked back to the manor, Miss Marple passed the church, where Peter Weston was sweeping the steps. He started at her approach, his broom pausing mid-stroke. "Good morning, Miss Marple," he said, his voice strained. Terrible business about Tom, isn't it?" "Terrible indeed," she replied, her gaze gentle but searching. "You were fond of him, I suppose. He must have been kind to you, working so closely with the cricket team." Peter's eyes flickered, and he muttered something about Tom being a good man before hurrying inside. Miss Marple watched him go, noting the flush on his cheeks. Guilt, she thought, or perhaps just fear. That evening, as she sat by the fire in the Langley Manor, Miss Marple's knitting needles moved steadily, her thoughts weaving a web of their own. The village secrets were like the stitches in her work, each one small, but together forming something intricate and revealing. Roger's ambition, Dr. Finch's debts, Peter's furtive behaviour, and the shadow of an old love from Little Weatherby, all were pieces of a larger truth. She thought of a long-ago murder in a seaside town, where a seemingly trivial grudge had led to violence. The heart, she mused, is so often at the root of it all. As Beatrice chattered about the upcoming church fete, Miss Marple's mind was elsewhere, sifting through the day's revelations. The murder of Tom Harrow was no random act. It was rooted in the quiet tensions of Chipping Hollow, in secrets that had simmered for years. She would need to tread carefully, to listen and observe, for the truth, she knew, was always there, waiting to be unravelled by a patient hand. Chapter 4. The Alibi Puzzle. The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains of the Langley Manor, casting delicate patterns on the polished oak floor where Miss Jane Marple sat, her knitting a soft counterpoint to the distant clatter of breakfast dishes. The village of Chipping Hollow, though outwardly resuming its daily rhythm, remained gripped by the shadow of Tom Harrow's murder. The cricket pavilion, now sealed off by Inspector Craddock's orders, stood as a silent reminder of the violence that had shattered the previous day's cheer. Miss Marple, her eyes keen despite their mild expression, sipped her tea and considered the tangle of motives and secrets she had begun to unravel. Today, she knew, would be a day for sifting alibis, for testing the stories that cloaked the truth. Inspector Craddock, his face etched with the strain of a sleepless night, had set up a temporary headquarters in the village hall, a stone's throw from the green. By mid-morning, he was methodically questioning the cricket team and others who had been near the pavilion when the scream rang out. Miss Marple, invited to sit in as an observer, a courtesy extended due to her reputation for noticing what others missed, settled quietly in a corner, her knitting needles clicking like a metronome. The hall, with its high beams and faded posters of past village events, felt oddly formal for such grim proceedings, yet it suited Craddock's brisk efficiency. Roger Blake, the team captain, was the first to face the inspector's scrutiny. He strode in with the confidence of a man accustomed to bending situations to his will, his tailored blazer impeccable despite the early hour. "I was on the field, Inspector," he said, his voice smooth as polished mahogany. "Warming up with the lads, tossing the ball about. Half the village saw me." His smile was disarming, but Miss Marple noted the faint tightening of his jaw when Craddock pressed for specifics. "Who exactly was with you at the moment the scream was heard?" the inspector asked. Roger's eyes flickered, and he named two teammates. Both, Miss Marple recalled, had been at the far end of the green, too distant to confirm his precise whereabouts. A clever man, she thought, but perhaps not clever enough. Dr. Ernest Finch followed, his thin frame hunched as if bearing an invisible weight. His hands, clutching a worn leather bag, trembled slightly as he sat. "I was in my surgery," he said, his voice high and uneven. "Checking patient records, you know, the usual things." But when Craddock asked if his nurse, Miss Ellis, could verify this, Dr. Finch faltered. She stepped out for a bit. To the chemist, I think." His eyes darted to the window, and Miss Marple, her needles pausing briefly, made a mental note. A surgery unattended, even for an hour, left a gap in time that could conceal much. She recalled Dr. Finch's strained expression at the Pavilion, and the village talk of his financial troubles. "Debt," she mused, "can make a man reckless." Young Peter Weston was the last of the trio, his boyish face pale as he entered the hall. His hands twisted the hem of his sweater, and his eyes avoided Craddock's steady gaze. "I was at the vicarage," he said quickly, almost too quickly, "helping Mother with the hymnals for Sunday." Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Your mother will confirm this, I presume?" Peter nodded, but his flush deepened, and Miss Marple's keen eyes caught the hesitation in his posture. She thought of her earlier encounter with him at the church, his nervous haste, and the way he had avoided her questions about Tom Harrow. Later, when Craddock spoke privately with Mrs. Weston, the vicar's wife confirmed Peter's story, but her voice wavered, and her hands fussed with her apron. Mothers, Miss Marple thought, will protect their sons even when they doubt them. With the interviews concluded, Craddock dismissed the men, but Miss Marple lingered, her gaze drifting to the village hall's notice board, where a schedule of the cricket match still hung. She approached Craddock, her manner deferential. "Might I take another look at the Pavilion, Inspector?" she asked. "Sometimes the smallest things speak the loudest." Craddock, accustomed to her unerring instincts, nodded, and together they walked to the green. The Pavilion was eerily quiet, the bunting from the match now sagging in the damp air. Inside the scoring room, the scene remained as Miss Marple remembered. The overturned chair, the scattered papers, the blood-stained bat now gone to the police laboratory. She moved to the window, her fingers brushing the sill where the scuff mark remained. There, caught in a splinter of wood, was a tiny thread of blue wool, so fine it might have been overlooked. "Curious," she said softly, her mind flicking to Roger's blue blazer and the scarf Peter had worn the previous day, a gift from his mother knitted in a vivid shade of blue. She bent closer, noting the faint trace of dirt on the thread, as if it had snagged during a hurried exit. Outside, she circled the Pavilion again, her eyes scanning the ground. Near the window, she found another clue. A cigarette stub, half buried in the grass, its brand matching the one she had seen inside. Mrs. Price's words about Michael Reed, the little Weatherby player with his fancy cigarettes, echoed in her mind. Could an outsider have slipped into the Pavilion unnoticed? The idea seemed unlikely, given the crowd, but Miss Marple knew better than to dismiss any possibility. She recalled a case from her youth, where a stranger's presence had been the key to a village murder, though the motive had been deeply personal. Returning to the manor, Miss Marple sat by the fire. Her knitting resumed as Beatrice chattered about the village's shock. The alibis, Miss Marple reflected, were like a poorly knitted scarf, full of holes that only careful tugging would reveal. Roger's confidence masked a gap in his timeline. Dr. Finch's absence from his surgery left room for doubt. and Peter's nervous demeanour suggested more than youthful anxiety. The blue thread, the cigarette, the scuff mark, these were not random, but threads in a pattern she was beginning to discern. As the afternoon faded into evening, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to human nature, that vast and tangled skein she had spent a lifetime unravelling. Alibis, she murmured, her needles clicking, are only as strong as the truth behind them. She thought of a long-ago case in a neighbouring county, where a man's perfect alibi had crumbled under the weight of a single overlooked detail. In Chipping Hollow, the truth was there, waiting in the shadows of the pavilion, and Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, was determined to bring it into the light. Chapter 5. A Hidden Past. The air in Chipping Hollow carried a crisp edge as autumn tightened its grip. The leaves on the village green tinged with amber and russet. Miss Jane Marple, wrapped in a shawl against the morning chill, walked slowly along the lane toward the village pub, the Green Man, her steps deliberate but her mind racing. The murder of Tom Harrow had stirred the quiet currents of the village, and she sensed that the answers lay not only in the present, but in the tangled roots of the past. Her knitting bag swung lightly at her side, a comforting weight, as she considered the clues that had begun to form a pattern. The blue thread, the strange cigarette, the scuff mark on the pavilion's windowsill. Each was a thread in a tapestry, and Miss Marple knew that to unravel a murder, one must follow every strand, no matter how faint. The Green Man was a low-beamed establishment, its walls adorned with faded photographs of cricket teams and horse brasses that gleamed dully in the firelight. Mr. Giles, the barman, was polishing glasses behind the counter, his weathered face creased with the wisdom of one who had heard every village tale. He greeted Miss Marple with a nod, unsurprised by her presence. "Morning, miss," he said, setting a glass of lemonade before her without being asked. "Terrible business with Tom Harrow. Never thought I'd see such a thing in Chipping Hollow." "Nor I, Mr. Giles," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but her eyes sharp. "Tom was well liked, I understand. It makes one wonder what could have driven someone to such an act." She sipped her lemonade, letting the pause invite confidences. Mr. Giles, never one to resist a listener, leaned closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur. "Tom was a good sort, but he had his history," he began. "Years back, 30 years, maybe more, he was set to marry Clara Reed from Little Weatherby. Pretty lass she was, with a laugh that could light up a room. But something went wrong, nobody ever knew what. Clara up and left him, married a man from London. Broke Tom's heart, they say. He never spoke of it, but he'd get a look in his eye whenever Little Weatherby came up in talk." Miss Marple's needles, which she had taken out to occupy her hands, paused briefly. "Clara Reed," she said thoughtfully. "And does she still have family in Little Weatherby?" "Not her, but her nephew, Michael Reed," Mr. Giles replied, wiping the counter with a rag. "He's on their cricket team. Bit of a hothead. Like his uncle, Clara's brother, who was a bowler back in the day. There was bad blood between him and Tom too, after Clara left. Fists were thrown once, outside this very pub." He chuckled, then sobered. "Michael's here for the match, of course. Smokes those odd cigarettes, Turkish, I think, always dropping the stubs about." Miss Marple's mind flashed to the cigarette stub in the pavilion, its paper marked with a faint gold band. A coincidence, perhaps, but she had long ago learned to distrust coincidences. "Thank you, Mr. Giles," she said, rising. "You've been most helpful." As she stepped into the street, she filed away this new piece of the puzzle, her thoughts turning to the possibility that Tom's death might be linked to a grudge older than most of the village's residents. Her next stop was the vicarage, where she hoped to speak with Mrs. Weston, Peter's mother. The vicarage garden was a riot of late roses, their scent heavy in the air. Mrs. Weston, a slight woman with a perpetually worried expression, was clipping herbs when Miss Marple arrived. "Oh, Miss Marple," she said, brushing dirt from her hands. "What a dreadful time this is. Poor Tom. I can't imagine who would do such a thing." "Nor can I yet," Miss Marple said, her tone gentle. "But I wonder if Peter might have seen something. He seems such an observant young man." She watched Mrs. Weston closely, noting the way her hands stilled, her eyes flickering with unease. "Peter's a good boy," Mrs. Weston said quickly. "He was here, you know, when it happened, helping me with the hymnals." Her voice was firm, but her fingers twisted the edge of her apron. A gesture Miss Marple recognized as the shield of a protective mother. She did not press further, merely nodding and commenting on the roses, but her mind was alert. Peter's alibi, like those of Roger Blake and Dr. Finch, was fragile, held together by loyalty rather than certainty. Later, at the village hall, Miss Marple joined Inspector Craddock, who was reviewing notes from the previous day's interviews. "The alibis are shaky," he admitted, rubbing his temple. "Blake's teammates can't pinpoint his exact movements. Finch's nurse was out, and young Weston's mother seems more anxious to protect him than to confirm his story." He glanced at Miss Marple, a hint of respect in his eyes. "Any thoughts, Miss Marple?" She hesitated, her fingers smoothing the wool in her lap. "I was thinking, Inspector, of a case in another village where a man's past came back to haunt him. Tom Harrow, I understand, had a connection to Little Weatherby through a woman named Clara Reed. And there's the matter of his will, changed recently, I believe, to leave his land to the cricket club. That might have stirred resentment." She did not mention the cigarette or the blue thread, preferring to let those clues simmer in her mind. Craddock raised an eyebrow. "Clara Reed? I'll look into it. And the will, yes, we've confirmed Tom visited a solicitor last month, left everything to the club, which didn't sit well with Roger Blake." He jotted a note, then added, "You've a knack for seeing what's hidden, Miss Marple." She smiled faintly. "It's only a matter of looking, Inspector." As she left the hall, her thoughts returned to the past, to Clara Reed, to Michael Reed, to the grudges that linger like shadows. She recalled a murder in a coastal town, where an old love had sparked a deadly chain of events. Could Tom's broken engagement, decades old, have left a wound deep enough to kill? Or was the answer closer to home, in the ambitions of Roger Blake or the fears of young Peter Weston? That evening, as she sat by the fire in the Langley Manor, Miss Marple's knitting needles moved steadily, her thoughts weaving a web of connections. The past, she knew, was never truly buried, and in Chipping Hollow it had risen to claim a life. The truth was there, in the whispers of old love and new greed, and she would find it, one careful stitch at a time. Chapter 6. The Second Clue. The skies over Chipping Hollow had turned leaden by the third day after Tom Harrow's murder, the air heavy with the promise of rain. Miss Jane Marple, undeterred by the weather, sat in the Langley Manor's conservatory, her knitting a soft rhythm against the patter of early drops on the glass roof. The village was restless, its usual calm fractured by whispered theories and sidelong glances. The pavilion remained closed, a stark silhouette against the grey horizon, but Miss Marple's thoughts were fixed on the clues that had begun to coalesce. The blue thread, the Turkish cigarette, the scuff mark, and now the whispers of Tom's past and his altered will. Each was a piece of a delicate mosaic, and she knew that a single new fragment could shift the entire picture. That morning, a discovery at the pavilion added fresh complexity to the puzzle. One of the groundsmen, tidying the area despite the police tape, had found a torn letter in the dustbin near the scoring room. Inspector Craddock, summoned to examine it, shared the find with Miss Marple when she joined him at the village hall. The letter, written in a hurried scrawl, was incomplete, its edges ragged as if ripped apart in haste. It read, "Tom, we must meet tonight. The pavilion, after dark. No one must know. R." The paper was cheap, the ink smudged, but the words carried a weight that made Craddock's brow furrow. "This could be key," he said, turning the fragment over in his gloved hands. "But whose R? Roger Blake's the obvious choice, given his row with Tom over the land." Miss Marple, peering at the letter through her spectacles, noted the uneven handwriting, as if the writer had been agitated. "It's possible, Inspector," she said softly, "but we mustn't assume. In my experience, the obvious answer is often a distraction." Her mind turned to other possibilities. Could R be someone less expected? Perhaps a figure from Tom's past, like a relative of Clara Reed. She kept the thought to herself, preferring to let it simmer as she considered the letter's implications. A secret meeting suggested a secret motive, and secrets, she knew, were the lifeblood of murder. Seeking to test her suspicions, Miss Marple visited the vicarage to speak with Peter Weston. The young man was in the garden, raking leaves with a distracted air, his face pale and drawn. "Good morning, Peter," she said, her tone as warm as if she were discussing the weather. "You must be dreadfully shaken by all this. Did you happen to notice anyone near the pavilion the night before the match? It's such a quiet spot after dark." Peter's rake paused, and his eyes flicked toward her, wary as a cornered animal. I didn't see much," he stammered. "I was there briefly, fetching something for the team, but it was dark. I thought I saw a shadow moving near the window, but I couldn't be sure." His voice trembled, and he resumed raking with unnecessary vigour. Miss Marple nodded, her expression sympathetic, but her mind catalogued his words. A shadow near the window. Could it be the same figure who left the scuff mark and the blue thread? Peter's nervousness suggested he knew more than he admitted, but fear, she reflected, could silence even the most honest tongue. Her next stop was Dr. Finch's surgery, a small building near the village square. The nurse, Miss Ellis, had returned from her errand the day of the murder, and Miss Marple hoped to clarify the doctor's movements. Miss Ellis, a brisk woman with a no-nonsense air, confirmed that Dr. Finch had left the surgery for about 20 minutes that morning. "He said he needed to check on a patient," she said, her lips pursed. "But he was back before the scream was heard, I'm sure." Her certainty was less convincing than her tone, and Miss Marple noted the gap in Dr. Finch's alibi, wide enough for a man to slip to the pavilion and back. As she left the surgery, Miss Marple paused at the village shop to buy a packet of tea, using the opportunity to probe Mr. Dobbs further. "I heard Tom Harrow was a cautious man," she said casually as he weighed her purchase. "Did he ever mention trouble with anyone? Perhaps someone from outside the village?" Mr. Dobbs scratched his chin. "Not trouble exactly, but he did say something odd a week ago. Mentioned a letter he'd got, something about settling old scores. Didn't say who sent it, but he looked proper rattled." Miss Marple thanked him, her thoughts circling back to the torn letter in the dustbin. Could it be the same one, or another? The possibility of multiple letters hinted at a deeper intrigue, perhaps tied to the old feud with little Weatherby. That afternoon Miss Marple returned to the pavilion, permitted by Craddock to examine the dustbin where the letter was found. The bin, tucked behind a hedge, was a rusty affair, its contents a mix of discarded programs and food wrappers from the match. She sifted carefully, her gloved hands uncovering nothing more, but the act clarified her thoughts. The letter, she reasoned, had been discarded in haste, perhaps by someone who feared being seen. Its cryptic message and the initial R pointed to a clandestine meeting, but whether it had occurred and whether it led to murder remained unclear. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by the fire in the Langley Manor, her knitting a steady rhythm as Mrs. Langley fretted about the village's mood. "It's as if we're all suspect, Jane," she said, wringing her hands. "Even Arthur's jumpy, and he's usually so steady." Miss Marple smiled, her eyes distant. The letter, Peter's shadow, Dr. Finch's absence, all were threads in a web that grew more intricate by the hour. She recalled a case from years past in a quiet hamlet, where a single note had unlocked a murder's motive, revealing a betrayal hidden for decades. "The truth," she murmured, her needles clicking, "is like a shadow. It moves before you see it clearly." The murder at the cricket pavilion was no impulsive act. It was planned, rooted in secrets that spanned years. Whether the killer was Roger, with his thwarted ambitions, Peter, with his guilty glances, or someone tied to Tom's long-ago love, Miss Marple knew the answer lay in the delicate balance of what was said and what was left unsaid. She would watch and listen, as she always did, until the shadow of truth took shape. Chapter 7. The Trap. The fourth day since Tom Harrow's murder dawned with a drizzle that cloaked Chipping Hollow in a soft grey veil, muting the village's usual vibrancy. Miss Jane Marple, seated at the breakfast table in the Langley Manor, gazed out at the sodden green, her knitting folded neatly beside her untouched toast. The clues she had gathered, the blue thread, the Turkish cigarette, the scuff mark, the torn letter signed R, formed a delicate web in her mind, each strand pointing to a truth that remained just out of reach. She knew, with the quiet certainty born of experience, that to catch a murderer one must sometimes lay a trap, as subtle and precise as a spider's silk. Today, she resolved, would be the day to set it. Inspector Craddock, his face etched with the fatigue of a case that refused to yield, called at the manor mid-morning to share his latest findings. "The bat's clean of prints," he said, sinking into an armchair with a sigh. "The lab confirmed it was wiped, likely with a cloth, and that letter, R, could be Roger Blake, but we've no proof he wrote it. His handwriting doesn't match, though he could have disguised it." He rubbed his temples, glancing at Miss Marple. "Any ideas, Miss Marple? You've a way of seeing through the fog." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly behind her spectacles. "I was thinking, Inspector, that a village meeting might be useful, perhaps to discuss the cricket club's future, now that Tom's land is to go to it. People reveal themselves when they're stirred up, don't they?" Her tone was mild, but Craddock caught the glint of purpose in her words. He nodded, sensing she had a plan, and agreed to arrange the meeting for that evening in the village hall. The idea, Miss Marple explained to Mrs. Langley as they prepared tea, was to create a setting where the suspects, Roger Blake, Dr. Finch, Peter Weston, and even Michael Reed from Little Wetherby, would be under scrutiny, their reactions observed. "A little pressure," she said, her needles clicking, "can make even the most careful person slip." Beatrice, flustered by the thought of hosting such a gathering, agreed to send invitations, her husband's position as cricket club president lending authority to the event. By evening, the village hall was filled with a restless crowd, the air thick with curiosity and unease. Colonel Langley stood at the front, his military bearing strained, as he opened the meeting with a call for unity in the wake of Tom's death. Miss Marple, seated near the back, her knitting bag at her feet, watched the suspects closely. Roger Blake lounged in a chair near the front, his smile polished, but his fingers tapping a restless rhythm on his knee. Dr. Finch, his face drawn, sat rigidly, his eyes darting to the door as if longing to escape. Peter Weston, beside his mother, kept his head down, his hands clasped tightly. Michael Reed, invited as a courtesy to the rival team, stood at the side, his expression guarded, a cigarette dangling from his fingers. Craddock, at Miss Marple's suggestion, mentioned the torn letter found in the pavilion's dustbin, letting the words hang in the air. "We believe it may point to the killer," he said, his voice steady. "Someone with the initial R had a secret meeting with Tom the night before his death." Roger Blake's head jerked up, his smile faltering, and he protested. "Plenty of people have that initial, Inspector. It's hardly evidence." His voice was sharp, and Miss Marple noted the flush creeping up his neck. Dr. Finch, meanwhile, grew paler, his handkerchief twisted into a knot. Peter Weston's eyes remained fixed on the floor, but his mother's hand tightened on his arm, her lips pressed thin. Michael Reed shifted his weight, dropping his cigarette and grinding it out with a quick motion. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on him, recalling the Turkish cigarette stub in the pavilion. Guilt, she thought, or merely discomfort? Then, with Craddock's approval, Miss Marple rose, her small figure commanding attention despite her gentle demeanour. "It's such a sad affair," she said, her voice carrying a quiet authority. "But I understand there's talk of a witness who saw someone in a blue garment fleeing the pavilion that morning. It's a small thing, perhaps, but it might help us understand what happened." The lie was calculated, a bait to provoke a reaction. Roger Blake in his blue blazer scoffed loudly, insisting he'd been on the field all morning. Peter Weston touched the blue scarf around his neck, a gift from his mother, and his face flushed scarlet. Dr. Finch's eyes widened, but he said nothing, his fingers clutching his chair. The meeting ended with plans for a memorial match in Tom's honour, but Miss Marple's trap was only half set. That night she proposed a final gambit to Craddock. "Leave a note in the pavilion," she suggested, something vague about new evidence, perhaps a witness to the murder itself. "Place it where it can be found, and watch who comes looking." Craddock, though sceptical, agreed, and together they crafted a note. Evidence found. Someone saw the killer leave the pavilion. Details to follow. They placed it in a scorebook on the scoring room table, left the pavilion door unlocked, and concealed themselves in the shadows of a nearby hedge, the drizzle masking their presence. As midnight approached, the village was silent, the pavilion a dark shape against the clouded sky. Miss Marple, her shawl wrapped tightly, waited patiently, her eyes fixed on the door. At last, a figure emerged from the gloom, moving stealthily towards the pavilion. It was Peter Weston, his scarf a faint blur in the dark. He slipped inside, his movements frantic as he rifled through the scorebook. Craddock stepped forward, his torchlight pinning Peter in place. "Looking for something, lad?" he asked, his voice firm. Peter froze, the note clutched in his hand, his face a mask of panic. Miss Marple, emerging from the shadows, watched him with a mixture of pity and resolve. It's often the young, she thought, who act without thinking. The trap had sprung, but the full truth, she knew, was yet to be revealed. As Craddock led Peter away for questioning, Miss Marple's thoughts returned to a case in another village, where a desperate act had unravelled under the weight of a single, well-placed lure. The pavilion held its secrets still, but they were beginning to speak. Chapter 8. The culprit unmasked. The drizzle had thickened into a steady rain by the time Inspector Craddock led Peter Weston from the cricket pavilion. The young man's shoulders slumped under the weight of his discovery. Miss Jane Marple followed at a discreet distance, her shawl damp but her mind alight with the clarity that comes when a puzzle's final pieces fall into place. The village of Chipping Hollow lay hushed under the midnight downpour, its cottages dark save for the occasional flicker of a lamp. The pavilion, its white walls ghostly in the wet night, seemed to hold its breath as the truth of Tom Harrow's murder emerged from the shadows. At the village hall, where Craddock had set up a makeshift interrogation room, Peter sat hunched in a wooden chair, his face pale and streaked with rain. The note Miss Marple and Craddock had planted, claiming a witness to the killer's escape, lay crumpled on the table before him. Miss Marple, seated quietly in a corner, her knitting untouched for once, watched Peter with a gentle but unflinching gaze. She'd seen this moment before, in other villages, other lives. The point where fear and guilt unravel a carefully guarded secret. Craddock, his voice firm but not unkind, leaned forward. "Why were you looking for that note, Peter? What were you afraid we'd find?" Peter's hands twisted together, his knuckles white. I didn't mean to," he whispered, his voice breaking. "It wasn't planned. I swear it wasn't." His eyes darted to Miss Marple, then away, as if her quiet presence was more daunting than Craddock's authority. The room was silent save for the patter of rain against the windows, and Miss Marple waited, knowing that silence often coaxes truth where questions fail. "It was the money," Peter blurted at last, his words tumbling out like a dam breaking. "I'd been taking from the cricket club's funds, small amounts to pay off debts, gambling debts. I got in with some fellows in Little Wetherby, and it got out of hand." He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. "Tom caught me that night, a month ago, in the pavilion. He didn't tell anyone, but he said he'd report me if I didn't stop. I tried, but I owed too much." Miss Marple's eyes softened with pity, though her mind remained sharp. She recalled Peter's nervous glances, his mother's protective hesitance, and the blue wool thread caught on the pavilion's windowsill, a match for the scarf he wore, knitted by Mrs. Weston. "Go on, Peter," she said gently, her voice like a nudge to a faltering child. "What happened that morning?" Peter swallowed, his voice barely audible. "Tom called me to the pavilion before the match, said he'd checked the accounts and knew I'd taken more. He was going to tell father, tell everyone. I panicked. I didn't mean to hurt him, but he grabbed my arm and I picked up the bat. It was just there on the table. I swung it and he fell." His voice broke into a sob. "I wiped it clean and climbed out the window. I didn't know what else to do." Craddock's face was grim, but he pressed on. "And the letter signed R? Was that you trying to throw us off?" Peter shook his head, bewildered. Craddock glanced at Miss Marple, who nodded slightly, her thoughts turning to the other piece of the puzzle. "That letter," she said softly, "was not Peter's doing, Inspector. I believe it came from Roger Blake." She explained, her voice calm but certain. "Roger wrote to Tom, pressing him about the land deal, hoping to meet in secret to sway him. The R was his, but the meeting never happened. Tom was already dead by the time it was meant to take place. One letter was discarded, perhaps by Roger himself, to avoid suspicion." She paused, her eyes on Peter. "But the blue thread, Peter, was yours? It caught on the sill as you fled, didn't it?" Peter nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I didn't mean to kill him," he whispered. "I just wanted to stop him talking." Miss Marple sighed, her heart heavy with the tragedy of youth, undone by desperation. She thought of a case long ago, in a northern village, where a young man's rash act had led to a similar confession, the weight of guilt too heavy to bear. Craddock, satisfied, called for a constable to take Peter into custody. As they left the hall, Miss Marple lingered, her gaze on the rain-streaked windows. The cigarette stub, she reflected, had been a distraction. Likely Michael Reed's, dropped during the match, but unrelated to the crime. Dr. Finch's debts and Roger's ambitions had clouded the trail, but Peter's fear had been the key, his scarf the silent witness to his flight. She recalled the lipstick on the teacup, a detail that had puzzled her. But now she suspected it was Lucy Carter's, who had perhaps entered the pavilion earlier, unnoticed, and left the cup behind. Returning to the Langley Manor, Miss Marple sat by the fire, her knitting resumed at last. Mrs. Langley, pale with shock at the news of Peter's arrest, hovered nearby. "Such a young boy," she murmured. "How could he?" Miss Marple's needles clicked steadily, her voice gentle but firm. "Fear, Beatrice, can drive even the kindest heart to darkness. Peter acted in a moment of panic, and now he must face the consequences." As the rain drummed on the roof, Miss Marple's thoughts wandered to the village, its peace fractured but not broken. The cricket match would resume one day, the pavilion would hum with life again, but the memory of Tom Harrow's death would linger, a quiet lesson in the fragility of human nature. She thought of another murder, years before, where a single act of desperation had rippled through a community. "The heart," she murmured, "is so easily led astray." With Peter's confession, the mystery was solved, the web of clues untangled. Miss Marple folded her knitting, her work in Chipping Hollow done. As she prepared to leave the village, she knew the truth had been worth seeking, not for justice alone, but for the clarity it brought to a place that had lost its way. The pavilion, silent under the rain, held no more secrets, and Miss Marple with her quiet wisdom, turned her thoughts to home.